In 1855, a frail 10-year-old orphan named Jacob Turner stepped off a Mississippi steamboat. He carried no family, no belongings, only chilling words. Jacob described a distant town called Oak Hollow, though he had never been there. He spoke of a broken courthouse clock, cotton fields beneath crooked oaks, and children buried by the press house. Some called him cursed, others chosen. How could he know their secrets? If you enjoy these journeys into the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our nation's shadows as we uncover Oak Hollow's buried past. To understand Jacob Turner's story, we have to step back into the America of 1855. It was a country caught in tension expanding, yet haunted by what expansion left behind. Along the Mississippi River, towns bloomed almost overnight, built on cotton, timber, and trade. But for every booming steamboat landing, there were silent tragedies, orphans without homes, families broken by epidemics, and secrets that small communities hoped would never come to light. The Mississippi itself was both lifeline and graveyard. Steamboats carried wealth, travelers, and goods, but they also carried cholera and yellow fever. One outbreak could sweep through an entire town in weeks, leaving dozens of children without parents. With no system of foster care as we know it today, orphans were often placed in overcrowded institutions, traded as cheap labor, or simply left to wander until someone out of charity or need took them in. Jacob Turner was one of thousands cast adrift by this cruel system. Towns along the river presented themselves as wholesome and God-fearing. Churches stood tall, sermons thundered against sin, and schoolhouses promised order and discipline. Yet behind the neat white fences and steeples, darker realities often lurked. Wealthy families expanded their fortunes not only through cotton and trade, but through practices that exploited the poor, the enslaved, and the unwanted. Orphans, in particular, were easy prey, silent, powerless, and forgotten by most. And then there was Oak Hollow. On the surface, it was a thriving plantation town in the heart of the valley. Its residents prided themselves on industry, faith, and the prosperity of their fields. Cotton bales stacked high on river docks painted the picture of success. But whispers followed Oak Hollow wherever traders went. Too many farmhands disappeared without explanation. Too many children, sent there as laborers, were never seen again. It was the kind of place travelers passed through quickly, keeping their questions to themselves. In 1855, America was also a nation fractured along moral lines. Abolitionist voices grew louder in the North, clashing with Southern defenders of slavery. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had only deepened divisions, making the escape of enslaved people more dangerous and their capture more profitable. These tensions gave rise to paranoia in small towns. Outsiders were distrusted, secrets were buried deep, and those who spoke too freely often disappeared. Jacob Turner was born into this landscape of fear and silence. As a child orphaned by cholera, he should have been just another nameless figure swallowed by the system. Yet, when he arrived at that steamboat landing, he carried knowledge no child should have. His words pointed not to the future, but to the sins of the past sins Oak Hollow had done everything to erase. What made Jacob's knowledge so chilling was not just its accuracy, but the timing. In 1855, memory was fragile, and history was written by those with power. Towns like Oak Hollow thrived on forgetting. Their prosperity depended on silence. For a boy with nothing but the clothes on his back to suddenly speak of hidden graves and missing children threatened not just reputations, but the entire social order. And so, the question is not simply how Jacob knew these things, but why his voice surfaced then, in that moment. Was it chance? Was it divine providence? Or was it the voices of the forgotten, carried through him to force a reckoning? What we do know is this: America in 1855 was a country desperate to control its story. But Jacob Turner's presence showed that buried truths have a way of clawing back to the surface. And Oak Hollow wealthy, respected, and terrified of exposure, was about to face a reckoning it had long avoided. Jacob Turner had been in the river town for only a few days when people began to realize something was strange about him. At first, most dismissed his mutterings as the confused ramblings of a sickly child still mourning his parents. But the more he spoke, the harder it became to ignore. His words were not vague, nor were they the wild fantasies of a boy with an overactive imagination. They were precise, measured, and disturbingly accurate descriptions of a place called Oak Hollow, a plantation town miles away that Jacob had never laid eyes on. One evening, sitting by the fire in the home of a family that had taken him in temporarily, Jacob startled everyone by describing a courthouse clock that no longer struck noon. He claimed its gears were broken, and that the people of Oak Hollow could only guess the hour when the sun passed overhead. The farmer who had offered him shelter stiffened, for he had once traveled through Oak Hollow and remembered that very detail. How could a boy from Boston know such a thing? The next day, Jacob spoke of a church with peeling white paint and a front door that never quite closed. He described how the hinges creaked loudly during sermons, and how children sitting in the pews would giggle when the wind blew it open. He even mentioned a crooked oak tree at the edge of the cotton fields, where farmhands often rested in the shade. These were not things written in newspapers or spoken about by travelers. These were the small, intimate details only someone who had lived in Oak Hollow would know. What disturbed his listeners most were his nightly terrors. Jacob would wake screaming, insisting that children cry from under the ground. He muttered about shoes buried beneath the press house, about little hands clawing at the dirt. More than once, he whispered names of boys and girls no one in the river town recognized. But when word spread to Oak Hollow itself, families grew pale. Some of those names matched children who had been sent to the town years earlier and had never come back. As his stories spread, townsfolk divided into camps. Poor laborers and farmers began to believe Jacob carried a gift, or perhaps a curse, that allowed him to see what others wanted to keep hidden. They gathered to hear him speak, pressing him for more details, though he seemed frightened by the burden of knowledge he could not explain. Meanwhile, wealthier men muttered that the boy was dangerous, a liar whose words could stir unrest if left unchecked. One evening, a merchant pressed Jacob for proof. The boy quietly sketched, with charcoal on scrap paper, the layout of Oak Hollow's main street. He drew the courthouse, the church, the blacksmith's shop, and the sagging covered bridge leading out of town. The lines were shaky, but the proportions and details were undeniable. Anyone who had been to Oak Hollow could confirm it was correct. When the sketch was shown to traders and riverboat men who passed through the region, their responses were identical. That's Oak Hollow, no mistake. Still, Jacob claimed he had never been there. He swore he had grown up in Boston, that his parents were taken by cholera, and that he had never traveled farther than the docks. His eyes, wide and terrified, suggested he was telling the truth, or at least the truth as he understood it. The final straw came when Jacob described an orchard outside of Oak Hollow, where he said the ground breathed at night. He told of soft earth that rose and fell as if the soil itself were alive. To him, it was a place where the lost children were buried, their restless souls shifting beneath the surface. Listeners shuddered, for though the orchard was rarely spoken of, there had long been whispers that workers disappeared there without a trace by now. The boy's reputation had grown beyond the river town. Word of his visions reached Oak Hollow, and while some dismissed the stories as nonsense, others grew uneasy. If Jacob's claims were baseless, why did they match too closely with the whispers townsfolk had tried so hard to bury? To the people around him, one truth became undeniable. This was no ordinary orphan. Jacob Turner knew things he should not know, and his knowledge was tearing open old wounds the powerful would rather keep closed. His words were no longer seen as childish ramblings, but as a threat to the very foundation of Oak Hollow's prosperity. And soon, those in power would demand answers. By the time Jacob Turner had been in the valley for just a few weeks, his words had traveled farther than he ever had. Traders spoke of him on the riverboats, laborers carried his stories into taverns, and whispers of the Orphan prophet spread all the way back to Oak Hollow itself. For the first time in years, the town's buried secrets felt dangerously close to the surface. And so, the men who held authority, those who controlled Oak Hollow's wealth, reputation, decided it was time to confront the boy directly. The first to arrive was Sheriff Amos Whitfield, a broad man with a reputation for loyalty to the planter families who lined his pockets. Whitfield had kept Oak Hollow's order for more than a decade, which often meant looking the other way. He rode into the river town on horseback, demanding to see the orphan who dared to speak so boldly of things best left forgotten. When Jacob was brought before him, the boy trembled, though his voice remained steady. "You claim to know Oak Hollow," the sheriff said, glaring down at him. "Then tell me, what stands behind the courthouse?" Jacob hesitated, then whispered, "A pecan tree with a rope scar still in its limb." The sheriff's face hardened. He knew the tree well. So did every man in Oak Hollow, though none ever spoke of its past. It was where justice, or what passed for it, had been carried out, away from prying eyes. Jacob should not have known, yet he described it as if he had stood there himself. Next came Pastor Elijah Harper, the town's stern minister whose sermons often thundered about sin and redemption, but who was rumored to protect the interests of the wealthy. To Harper, Jacob was not a curiosity, but a danger. "The devil works through liars," he told the gathered crowd. "This boy is a vessel for corruption, poisoning minds with falsehoods." Yet when pressed, Harper could not explain how Jacob's words matched hidden truths known only to Oak Hollow's oldest families. The confrontation reached its peak when several planter families arrived. Men in fine coats, their wives clutching parasols, demanded the boy's silence. They accused him of being coached, of being used by rivals to smear Oak Hollow's reputation. One declared, "This child is a northerner, sent to spread abolitionist lies." Another spat the word witchcraft under his breath. Their fury betrayed their fear. Jacob's knowledge struck too close to truths they had long tried to erase. The townsfolk of the river settlement looked on uneasily. Some pitied the frail boy standing against men who could crush him with a word. Others, particularly the poorer families, felt a flicker of defiance. Jacob was speaking aloud what they had always suspected, that Oak Hollow's wealth was not merely the reward of hard work, but was stained by cruelty, by disappearances, by crimes no one dared name. The sheriff attempted to intimidate Jacob, leaning down so close their noses nearly touched. "If you've set foot in Oak Hollow, you tell me now. Who fed you these stories?" But Jacob only shook his head. "I've never been," he whispered. "They tell me in my sleep, the lost ones. They want you to listen." The room fell silent. The boy's words, soft yet steady, struck like a hammer. Even those who doubted him felt a shiver. Could he truly be carrying the voices of the dead? Or was he a clever child weaving lies? The sheriff ordered Jacob taken to the church to be questioned further, hoping to frighten him into silence. Yet every time they pressed him, the boy revealed another unsettling truth. The name of a family that vanished, the description of a gravestone removed, the secret path leading to the abandoned press house. Each word tightened the noose around Oak Hollow's silence. By the end of the day, the boy had not been broken. If anything, the authorities themselves seemed shaken. They could not admit his accuracy, nor could they dismiss him outright. Instead, they left the gathering with grim faces and whispered threats, warning that the boy's tongue could bring ruin if not stopped. The poor families murmured prayers over Jacob that night, while the wealthy plotted in hushed tones. What none of them realized was that the boy had already done what the dead demanded. He had cracked the surface of Oak Hollow's carefully guarded past. And soon, what lay beneath would claw its way into daylight. The whispers could not be contained. Jacob Turner's words had spread too far, and the things he described could not be dismissed as childish invention. The orchard, the crooked oak, the courthouse with the scarred pecan tree, too many details lined up with Oak Hollow's hidden past. But it was one phrase, spoken in a half-dream, that forced action. Shoes buried beneath the press house. At first, no one dared test it. To dig where Jacob pointed would mean dragging into daylight sins the town had spent decades burying. But the poor laborers, the ones who had always suspected that Oak Hollow's wealth came at too high a price, were not bound by loyalty to the planter class. They gathered in the cool night air, lanterns flickering, and decided they would see for themselves. The abandoned press house stood at the far edge of the cotton fields, sagging under years of neglect. Once it had been the pride of Oak Hollow's industry, a place where raw cotton was crushed and bundled for shipment. Now weeds and briars crept across its foundation, and boards rattled loose in the wind. The families who once ran it had long abandoned the site, claiming it was cursed after a series of unexplained accidents. Few dared to go near it, but on that moonless night, a handful of men, Jacob among them, carried spades and lanterns into the orchard beside it. The boy's pale face glowed in the dim light as he pointed to the earth. "Here," he whispered, "they sleep here." His voice cracked, but his eyes never left the ground. The first shovelfuls of dirt came up dry and dusty, releasing the smell of long undisturbed soil. The men dug in silence, sweat dripping, hearts pounding. Then one spade struck something hard. A hush fell. They scraped carefully, revealing a small leather shoe, cracked with age, but unmistakably a child's. Another dig revealed more cloth, fragments, rusted buckles, and then bones, pale against the dark earth. One of the men dropped his lantern in shock, its flame sputtering dangerously before being stamped out. Jacob fell to his knees, weeping. "They begged me to tell you," he cried, his voice breaking. "They wanted you to know." Word spread fast. By dawn, a crowd had gathered, their faces pale in the rising light. More digging revealed more remains, tiny skeletons, some still bound with rusted iron shackles. It was undeniable. Children had been buried here, discarded like refuse, beneath the shadow of Oak Hollow's prosperity. The scene turned the town upside down. Some wept openly, mourning children they had never known, but whose suffering now stained the soil. Others grew fearful, darting glances toward the wealthier families who stood at the edge of the crowd in stiff silence. These families knew the truth before the earth gave it up. They had built their comfort on silence, and silence had just been broken. The sheriff tried to seize control, declaring the boy a liar who had planted the evidence. But the crowd would not hear it. How could a frail orphan from Boston have hidden bones in a field he had never visited? How could he have known about the shoes, the shackles, the orchard? The questions swirled like a storm, and for the first time, Sheriff Whitfield's authority cracked. Jacob collapsed as the crowd pressed closer to the uncovered graves. His small body convulsed with fever, his face pale and drenched with sweat. Through gasps, he whispered of nights filled with voices, of children calling to him across miles. "They wanted to be found," he muttered before losing consciousness. Carried back to the farmer's home, Jacob drifted between life and death for days. Meanwhile, Oak Hollow fractured. Some demanded justice, calling for the guilty to be named and punished. Others insisted the graves be reburied and the boy silenced before outsiders learned the truth. To admit the crime would destroy the town's reputation, its wealth, and its future. In hushed tones, elders recalled what had been hidden for so long. Orphans sent to Oak Hollow as cheap labor, enslaved children too weak to work, and runaways caught in the fields. They had vanished not by chance, but by deliberate cruelty. The graves at the press house were not the work of one man, but of a system that fed Oak Hollow's prosperity. And now, because of Jacob Turner, the system's secrets lay open for all to see. The discovery at the press house was more than a scandal. It was proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried, claws its way to the surface. Oak Hollow could no longer pretend innocence, and those who profited most would stop at nothing to contain the damage, even if it meant silencing the boy who had spoken for the dead. The graves beneath the press house had spoken, and for a moment it seemed Oak Hollow might finally be forced to confront the sins it had buried. But towns like Oak Hollow were built not on truth, but on silence, and silence, once broken, must be patched over quickly. At first, the discovery stirred raw outrage. Mothers clutched their children tighter, fathers muttered prayers, and farmhands refused to work in fields that now felt poisoned by guilt. Jacob Turner, the frail boy who had led them to the graves, lay weak with fever, his body trembling as if the cries of the dead had drained the life from him. For many, this was proof that he was chosen by God, a vessel through which the forgotten demanded justice. But for the powerful, Jacob was something else entirely. A danger. The planter families, those who had built their fortunes on cotton and human misery, moved swiftly to regain control. Behind shuttered doors, meetings stretched long into the night. Voices were hushed, but the intent was clear. If Jacob Turner's words spread beyond the valley, Oak Hollow would be destroyed. Merchants would turn away, river trade would vanish, and the town's name would become synonymous with atrocity. The stakes were not just reputations, but livelihoods, inheritances, and the legacy of families who believed themselves untouchable. Sheriff Whitfield was the first to act. He rode out to the farmhouse where Jacob lay and warned the family sheltering him. "That boy brings nothing but ruin," he growled. "You keep him here, you bring the same upon yourselves." His eyes, cold and certain, left no doubt the sheriff was not there to protect, but to intimidate. Soon after, the pastor thundered from his pulpit. He declared that Jacob was a vessel of wickedness, and that his visions were tools of the devil, meant to divide good Christian folk. "It is not the Lord who speaks through him," Harper cried, his voice echoing through the church rafters. "It is the serpent, tempting us to turn on one another." His words carried weight among those eager to bury the scandal under a veil of righteousness. Yet not everyone believed. Poor farmers whispered that the pastor's fury proved Jacob's truth. Laborers, who had lost loved ones to Oak Hollow's silence, saw in the boy a reckoning long overdue. The town split into factions, the powerful who demanded silence, and the powerless who clung to the boy's words as justice for generations of suffering. Fracture grew wider when witnesses began to vanish. One by one, men who had dug at the press house disappeared. A young farmhand was found floating in the river. His death ruled an accident, despite bruises along his neck. Another was said to have run off in the night, though his family swore he had no reason to leave. Fear took root. People understood without speaking it aloud. Oak Hollow's leaders were erasing the evidence, not just in the soil, but in human memory. Jacob himself became the focus of whispered curses. Rumors spread that crops near the farmhouse where he slept began to wither, that animals avoided the boy's presence, that his fevered cries at night brought storms. Some whispered he was cursed, not chosen punishment upon the town for listening to him at all. One evening, lanterns flickered outside the farmhouse. The family who had sheltered Jacob opened their door to find a note nailed into the wood. "Send him away, or you will share his fate." The message was unsigned, but everyone knew who had sent it. By now, Jacob was too weak to resist. His body was thin, his eyes hollow, yet his voice remained eerie in its conviction. "They will not let me stay. He told the farmer's wife one night, his words faint, "But even if they silence me, the ground will still speak." Within days, the sheriff returned with 2 deputies. They claimed Jacob would be taken for his own safety, though no one believed it. The farmer's wife wept as they carried the boy away, his head slumped against the sheriff's chest. Neighbors watched in silence, some crossing themselves, others bowing their heads in shame. No one dared intervene. Oak Hollow had been split open, and what leaked from the wound was fear, suspicion, and guilt. The powerful had chosen their path, not confession, not justice, but erasure. And the frail orphan who had given the dead their voice was now in their grasp. Whether he would survive what came next, no one could say. Jacob Turner was never seen in Oak Hollow again. Some claimed the sheriff had delivered him to a distant orphanage upriver, where his visions could trouble no one. Others whispered he was carried into the woods at night, left in a shallow grave beside those whose secrets he had revealed. Whatever the truth, his sudden disappearance sealed Oak Hollow's fate. In the weeks following his removal, the town moved quickly to restore its image. The press house was torn down, its foundations scattered and burned. The orchard where bones had been unearthed was plowed under and replanted with cotton, as if crops could smother memory. A fresh coat of paint brightened the courthouse. New sermons thundered from the pulpit, reminding the faithful that gossip was a sin and that God alone was judge. But for those who had seen the graves with their own eyes, no whitewash could erase what lay beneath the soil. Families whispered at night, wondering which of their children might have joined the voiceless dead, wondering whether their own silence had made them complicit. The divide in Oak Hollow deepened. Poorer families grew resentful, muttering that their children had always been the first to vanish, the first to be sacrificed when labor was cheap and lives expendable. Wealthy families, meanwhile, doubled down on their defenses, insisting the discoveries were exaggerated, that the boy's claims were tricks of the devil. They spread new rumors. Jacob had been a thief, a lunatic, a liar. If the dead were restless, it was because of him, not them. By winter, fear had crept into every corner of Oak Hollow. Crops failed early, blight spreading across the fields despite the prayers of the pastor. Some said the earth itself refused to yield after being forced to carry the weight of hidden bones. Travelers avoided the town, whispering of curses and haunted orchards. Trade dwindled, and with it, Oak Hollow's prosperity. The sheriff himself changed. Once proud and commanding, Whitfield grew restless and paranoid. He was said to ride at night, circling the orchard where the graves had been found, pistol drawn, as if expecting the dead to claw their way free. Others claimed they saw him speaking alone in the churchyard, muttering names under his breath. As for Pastor Harper, his sermons grew darker, laced with desperation. He thundered against sin, but his words trembled as though he feared divine judgment was already upon him. Attendance dwindled, families slipping away to other congregations, unwilling to hear the denials of a man whose hands were not as clean as he pretended. The most unsettling rumors centered, of course, on Jacob. Some said he died on the river journey, his fever consuming him before he ever reached another town. Others swore he lived long enough to grow into a young man, forever haunted by the voices of the dead that had spoken through him. A few even claimed he returned to Oak Hollow years later, thin and pale, only to vanish once more into the woods, as if swallowed by the very land he had unmasked. No record was ever found, no burial, no census entry, no trace. Jacob Turner slipped from history just as suddenly as he had entered it, leaving only whispers in his wake. And Oak Hollow? It never recovered. By the turn of the century, the town was little more than a collection of rotting buildings. The press house site grew over with weeds, the orchard abandoned, the courthouse collapsing under its own weight. Families moved on, carrying their wealth elsewhere, leaving behind a husk of a town too heavy with memory to survive. Locals said Oak Hollow was cursed not by Jacob, but by the children whose voices he had carried. Their cries, they claimed, still echoed at night when the wind rattled through the empty trees. Travelers who strayed too close often spoke of hearing whispers, of feeling small hands tugging at their clothes, begging to be remembered. Whether Jacob was truly cursed or chosen, no one could say. But his words had done what few dared attempt. He had cracked open Oak Hollow's silence, and though the town tried to bury it once more, the wound never healed. Today, little remains of Oak Hollow. Its name has been stripped from maps, its cotton fields swallowed by forest, its courthouse reduced to rubble beneath vines and moss. Travelers who pass through the valley find only silence, broken fences, and the occasional crumbling stone that hints at what once stood there. But though the town is gone, its story has never died. Generations of locals have carried whispers about the boy who came from nowhere and revealed everything. Some call him a prophet, others a cursed vessel. His name, Jacob Turner, still stirs unease, as if speaking it aloud might invite the same fate that befell Oak Hollow. Folklore has grown in the absence of fact. Hikers claim that when they cross the overgrown orchard at dusk, they hear faint cries rising from beneath the soil. Children dare one another to leave their shoes at the edge of the old press house foundation, where it said unseen hands will drag them into the earth by morning. And in the nearby towns, elders warn that if you hear your name whispered by a child's voice in the dark, it means Jacob has chosen you to remember what the living want forgotten. Historians debate whether Jacob Turner ever existed at all. Records of orphans in Boston are vague, and his trail vanishes the moment he stepped off the steamboat. Some insist his story was an invention, a parable meant to shame Oak Hollow after its decline. Others argue that no myth could account for the bones, the shackles, and the shoes uncovered beneath the press house. Whatever the truth, the effect is undeniable. Oak Hollow became a ghost long before its buildings crumbled. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Jacob Turner. Whether cursed, blessed, or simply burdened with impossible knowledge, he proved that silence is never permanent. No matter how carefully a town buries its sins, no matter how many sermons or fresh coats of paint are laid over the truth, the dead will not rest until their story is told. Jacob was their voice, and through him, the voices of countless others who vanished into America's shadows still cry out to be remembered. So I ask you, what do you believe? Was Jacob a gifted child chosen by Providence, or a cursed vessel carrying the voices of the dead? And more importantly, how many other towns in America carry their own Oak Hollow, waiting for someone brave enough to tell the truth? Thank you for walking through this story with me. If it struck you, if it made you question the shadows of our past, I invite you to join this community. Like this video, share it with others who value forgotten history, and subscribe for more stories that history tried to erase. Because the past is never truly gone, and sometimes it speaks through the least expected voices.